I went to my first DevOps conference by accident 4 years ago. How that happened was I saw a conference called Configuration Management Camp in Belgium. And I come from a long background in IT service management, so configuration management. That's the CMDB. There's a free conference about CMDB. I'll go. Before I went, I'd figured out the slight mistake I'd made. You know, this is a conference by the open source configuration management community, but I ran with it because I thought that'd be really interesting. It'd be interesting to sort of get a feel for this group of people on the fringe of this big movement that I didn't know a great deal about. And it was really an incredibly educational experience. It opened my eyes in a way that I think few people in the ITSM world had at that point seen to this tremendous cultural shift, this tremendous new movement that was emerging from the technology, from people who were trying to make their own jobs better and to do things better. What's happened to me since then, or what's happened since then, is I've ended up actually presenting at lots of DevOps conferences and finding myself reaching out to a lot of DevOps people. And a good example of why that's been happening, given that I work in this sort of enterprise service management tooling space, is that this is getting big. You know, we saw earlier, we saw Alice from Kaiser Permanente talk about starting with a little startup in the company, sequestered away, but then building that out into a very mainstream product delivery vehicle with hundreds and thousands and then millions of users. And that's a typical growth now of DevOps in enterprises. The challenge is that then brings you into a lot of existing structures and practices that can be pretty problematic, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about swarming as one example of a new way of thinking that I think is pretty much aligned with DevOps thinking, that we've been promoting and pushing, some of us, as a better way of doing things in the established service management world. And this quote sort of sums up the philosophy a little bit behind it. I presented about swarming at the British Computer Society, a venerable old chartered institution in the UK, back in May. And on the way to that presentation, I saw an article by Hank Barnes of Gartner talking about getting outside the box, working outside the box. Now, unfortunately, established service management practices, some of you may have met them already. Many of you, if you're working in DevOps teams that start to do that growth and start to push out tools to many, many users, might find yourself drawn into it too. And I'm not here to criticize ITSM. In fact, ITSM has done a lot of things incredibly well, including generating really great processes, tooling, functions, especially in those top levels, doing support at scale. But now with companies growing in DevOps, these organizations growing into big, important parts of the company. We'll talk a little later about a car company that's got a scale from a couple of 100,000 cars a year to literally hundreds of millions a year. Things tend to need to be at least adopted to some extent by enterprise support channels, because otherwise you're going to get bombarded, you're going to get overwhelmed with direct contents and tickets, and that doesn't scale. Unfortunately, what you often encounter is this classic tiered support model, where at the top you have a front line of support, typically a service desk, and relatively junior specialist people, often hired because they're good communicators and hired with the objective of building them up perhaps into technical people. What happens to a customer issue? Well, hopefully we fix it there. In fact, hopefully with especially a new generation of self-service technology, hopefully it never even gets there. But some things need further attention. And tickets will tend to escalate. If the front line can't fix it, they've usually got an escalation point, perhaps a team of more in-depth specialists. But at some point, these things often end up with product teams. And that's generally what's referred to as being the third line team. And in the world of DevOps, what I'm increasingly seeing is teams responsible for output from those DevOps organizations within companies find themselves in that third line. And this isn't really very good, because for many of those tickets, we're creating a structure which delays the progression of that issue to the people who probably know the answer. We're also creating a situation where often the people at the front line, they're typically a little less experienced, they're less specialist, they often don't quite know the right questions to ask. And so it'll go to the second line team and then bounce back angrily, hey, you didn't ask the right questions, we've got no information. So tickets then bounce around. If you're the customer, you don't really care what this structure is, you just care things take longer. And then importantly, and I've seen evidence of this here, talking to several people, the other thing these teams want to do is get rid of the ticket. Escalation is a way of finishing their job. But the trouble is they tend to kind of find the people to whom they can successfully escalate, and often that's individuals, and often those individuals start being overwhelmed. And if you're fixing stuff all day, you're not necessarily got the opportunity you want to build and innovate and deliver all the great things that this movement is doing. So people get burned out and overwhelmed. And this is where swarming has emerged as a philosophy that fundamentally is about tearing up those tiers of support. We don't want to do that model. Advocates of swarming want to replace this with something a lot less rigid and structural, something that can adapt better to the situation, and importantly, can get the right people into the process faster. And one thing I wanted to talk about today is how we do it, and I'll also talk about how some other companies do it. But here at BMC, we're maybe not traditionally thought of as a DevOps type organization, although we have plenty of elements within the company doing that. What we are is a very established enterprise software company with a lot of products and a long track record, but it also means we have a lot of big enterprise customers. We have a very global spread. We have a lot of support people. And about 4 years ago, some of those teams who were very involved with an organization called the Consortium for Service Innovation, big advocates of swarming, they actually decided they wanted to do things a little differently. They were pressured on mean time to recovery. They were pressured on customer satisfaction, and so they should be. I mean, everybody in the company, part of our incentive is customer satisfaction. None of us can divorce ourselves from that. So they decided to start building something a little different and start experimenting with swarming. And from there, it's actually grown into our standard support practice right across the business. Now, because swarming is fundamentally self-organizing, it does look a little different in different corners of the business, but we have a pretty standard structure that you'll find in most places, and that's to kind of organize support into 3 different types of swarm. And I'll just talk through these quickly. The first one, well, firstly, we want to automate as much as possible. Not all these issues ever get to support teams because we've got a lot of self-service technology. But those that do, we have an initial triage at the front line, and then a small proportion of those things are the big red flag, this has just got to be fixed at all costs, let's get on with it. So we give that a name of Severity 1 Swarm, and that'll typically be somebody who's on rotation with some other people perhaps also on the rota. They get in a room, they get everybody they need, they get stuff done. This is nothing new, we've just called it a swarm, but there's hardly an organization in the world that wouldn't do that if it's a big enough problem. Where the novelty is, though, is the other 99-point-something% of issues, which would typically drop straight into that kind of first, second line hierarchy. And we don't do that at all. What we do is we create what we call dispatch swarms. And these people are just there to cherry pick, primarily. They sit and they watch the incoming stream of issues, probably get together once an hour. They see what's come in their particular domain areas. And if they can fix something, they'll just fix it. Doesn't really matter what the prioritization is. We don't get hung up on the fact that, this thing's got a 5-day service level agreement. Doesn't matter. If they can fix it, they might as well just fix it. But to make that more effective, we also pair up experienced and less experienced support people. So not only is this a way of getting stuff to slightly more specialist people more quickly, it's also a really good way of sharing skills. The other thing that means is we can validate things, because some things still go on to product teams, of course they do, but these people, one of their jobs is to make sure that the information is correct so that it's a one-time pass. And then from there, stuff actually does go to product teams, and there's nothing fundamentally wrong with a single, you could argue, siloed product team, because a lot of things they can resolve pretty quickly, they know their product, there's no worries, there's nothing wrong with having that type of team. What is wrong is when these things start bouncing around between those teams. So for us, we're a global company. We have quite a few of these teams. Typically, different areas of product will have different global teams, so we can hand things around. And we've got quite a number of products, and a number of those products are both on-premise and cloud. And so obviously, we have potentially slightly complex support situations. You have the server team involved, networks, application. Now, one of the problems in a traditional structure is things often ping around those teams. And in fact, many of our customers, if we go asking about how their service desk tools are set up, they often have a counter So when something gets past 6 assignments or 7 assignments or some arbitrary number of assignments, it gets escalated to somebody. But again, as the customer, that's a pretty rotten experience because unbeknown to you, this thing is just bouncing around and nobody's taking ownership. So then we introduced something called the Backlog Swarm. And the principle here is that if you need help from those other teams, you can't bounce it around them. You can't pick out an individual. You come to a backlog swarm. And that backlog swarm, again, this is an area where there's variation between the way different teams do it. But to give a typical example, we have a server team associated with my product, and they're quite busy. They tend to meet once or twice or 3 times a day for about an hour as part of their day-to-day support role. So they might spend up to maybe a third of the day in swarms and the rest of the day working on their own stuff. And they'll just create these meetings. I have a standing invite to them. I can just drop in and listen in, and it's always really fascinating to do it. They'll sometimes they'll have brought materials, they'll bring video captured, screenshots, logs, whatever, but they'll also have primed the people they need to work with. And they drop in and they just work through these things between themselves. So that ticket stays with an owner. It doesn't ping around everywhere, but it also then has brought together the right people into a very constructive setting. And that can involve developers, engineers, DBAs, whatever. Now, to make this work, and again, I think this probably has a real echo in the DevOps world, we had to have several things in place, and probably the most important of those things was management backing. If you look at that Hank Barnes article with that I posted on the front page, and I have tweeted it, he talks about this wonderful, this ability to get people outside their box and how they can generate great results that way. But Hank actually talked about working in companies where, in his words, when he got outside his box, his colleagues really liked it, but his managers didn't. And he said, and they put me back in my box. We needed to trust our support teams to do this, and so it took a bit of a leap of faith on behalf of management, but I spoke to our VP of customer service last week, and I asked, I said, I'm talking about this at DevOps Enterprise, what would you say about swarming? He said it's been the most impactful change they've ever made in service delivery, and it's been instrumental in improving many, many measures. So that management backing was really important, but we also had to think about some of the things that managers really like, which is consistent metrics. And a lot of this, you find that metrics in service management are often focused on this notion that things are individually assigned. People love metrics, and people have a history of metrics, and you have to sort of persuade them, okay, we're not going to look at things in that way anymore. Your trend lines are dead. We start again. It also meant a lot more people were suddenly involved in dealing with customers, because these swarms are actually allowed to get the customer into the conversation if that's the appropriate thing to do. And for some of our people, they just need a little bit of guidance. If they were suddenly involved in those conversations when previously they'd been buried away in a third-line team, some adapt to that well. Other people, it's not been something they've got great experience with. So we had to have a lot of empathy with those people and help them through that process. As I already said, the ticket tennis, that was banned. Stop bouncing tickets around. Everybody hates it. It gets no great results. And then finally, we looked at how to do this. It really led to the birth of chat-based support, chat ops. It brought mobile more into the picture because people could get involved in these swarms and they were out and about. So it drove a bit of a tooling revolution as well for us. And that's been fun because now we're building that into our own products to help other customers with that. It led to pretty good results. I mean, this was just from the first year in one particular team, in one of our major product teams. So massive enhancement in customer satisfaction and time to resolution. Those are really important metrics, but I also like the human ones. And we found that actually the time it took to get people productive in their role dropped significantly, because suddenly they're not on their own working tickets, they spend their day paired up with people more experienced than them. Another concept that's been very well adopted by some of the big names in this space. I know Pivotal, for example, always talk about pair programming. And then even better, because some of these people now were not so overwhelmed being heroes, we found that they were able to develop new means of engaging with our customers, new support models, new ways of innovating within our support process as well. So that's been a really positive outcome over and above the easily measured metrics. So I spoke with a few of these people, I mean, just to kind of get their experiences. And one of the things that really stands out is that there is just universal enthusiasm for this practice amongst the people that do it every day. So this quote was just from last week from one of our senior support people. And I love the point he made. You know, in a lot of scenarios, you get a lot of combined knowledge of the subject. You get those experiences of the subject. So it pulls together those and you get something fixed quicker. But even if you don't have that, if nobody has ever seen this issue before, what you're actually doing is bringing a lot of experienced troubleshooters together and building on the power of their collective knowledge instead of, again, relying on them as individuals. I don't think I need to explain to this community the benefit of that kind of work. But it's been a bit of a revelation, I think, in some dusty corners of service management. And my favorite quote of all, this was one of the first people I ever talked with about swarming. And this chap, he works in the UK, so near me. And he's one of the most experienced support people we've got. He knows my product so well, you'd think there's nothing much he could learn. And yet he told me that in 1 year, he doubled his knowledge from where he was, just by engaging in this practice. So it was pretty, that was amazing to hear. But we're not the only ones doing it. This is an emergent practice now in a number of quite big, forward-thinking enterprises. And a couple of months ago, I spoke with Chad Jolly at Ford. Now, Chad works in the connected cars division, which if you look at some of the recent events within Ford, some very senior people from the connected cars division have become some very senior people at Ford in general. It's definitely a group that's very influential in the company, very DevOps-oriented. And this was this scaling problem I talked about at the start. They had to figure out a way with the same team of moving from 275,000 connected cars in their fleet in total, because somebody flipped the switch and said, okay, this technology now goes into every single car we build. And they build a lot of cars. And next year, they'll build a lot of cars. And the year after, they'll build a lot of cars. And before they know it, there'll be 1 billion things to support. So they needed to come up with ways to scale that support, and one of the biggest things they've done with that is swarming. And as Chad told me, this is the difference between moving things from 4 to 5 days just to get to the right place to getting it straight to the right place. And again, they don't swarm everything. Often the first-line support agent can fix things. But if they feel they need to initiate that swarm, they can push the button. Other teams supply somebody who's on rotation. And because they're working with a lot of cloud infrastructure providers, these days, often you might need to bring in somebody from Amazon or Google or Microsoft, particularly if you're consuming their services as part of your own services. So their engineers and technical support people are often involved in this process too. It was a nice example. Now, I've been incurably nice about swarming and not highlighted any negatives yet, and I thought I'd better go out and find some. So in the course of our research for our product work this year, my UX team and I, we've been out talking to quite a lot of companies, and you do see, that there is a sense that it's not all perfect, which is good. I think sometimes if something's too good to be true, it probably is. But even then, some of these negatives I question a little bit. The first one, this actually was the first comment on a blog I wrote last week about another type of swarm I saw where a chat-based service desk allowed its agents to put their customer on hold for 3 minutes, and then in that 3 minutes they can jump into a pool of support, of service experts, a couple of people on chat. And somebody pointed out, isn't that expensive? I think that comes from the mindset of pricing the time of frontline people as a lot cheaper than second-line people, and a lot cheaper than third-line people. So actually, when you're bringing those people into the process more often, it probably, by that metric, is a little more expensive. But I don't know, those tickets would have probably ended up with them anyway, so I wonder if things are being measured a little wrong there. Another perceived negative is that it's difficult to evaluate individual contributions. Again, I question this one a little because I've seen for many years individuals lauded for their amazing individual performance in these teams. Often these teams are not working as individuals. My favorite ever example was my UX person pointing at a service desk agent in a customer we visited and said, he's the busiest, he knows the most. I said, how do you know that? He said, because there are tracks in the carpet to his desk from every direction where people are pushing their chairs and going. Everywhere I go, you see these people are not necessarily working individually, but we've been measuring it individually, and I think all this does is highlights that the measurement was wrong in many cases. But nevertheless, these are perceptions that you'll hear. More practically, it can be a little hard to organize across time zones. You know, if you've got a swarm and then they need to go and another lot come along, it actually makes that a little more complex, I think, than when things just get individually handed over. And then there's some human factors. I mean, it's like any group conversation. You sort of have to set some guardrails to stop individuals taking over the conversation in some cases. And actually, it's quite hard to figure out who to bring in. If you're an inexperienced first-line support agent and you've got to figure out who to work with, well, we need mechanisms to ensure that you're bringing in the right people. And the Ford example where they have one person on rota at any time is a good one. But we do also see other concepts. I mentioned the Consortium for Service Innovation, one of the sort of leading definers of this practice. They talk about a concept called intelligent swarming, where you have sort of skills-based models and help those people get to the right people. And actually what we're doing is we're trying to take that a little further and explore how we can use AI and other concepts to try and help guide people to the right people, but also deal with the challenge of making sure that if somebody is the right person, they're not the right person on every single instance, because again, we're trying to avoid that hero factor. So that's an interesting and I think unsolved challenge that we're still working with. But anyway, this is a DevOps conference. What has this got to do with DevOps? Well, I think probably it's quite obvious, but firstly, this is an old quote now in the context of DevOps. It's 4 years old, but I think it probably still stands. If you just get assimilated into the practices as they stood, it's probably not going to work well for you. So that was from that was from IDC in 2014. But if someone published that today, I don't think anyone would question it. DevOps has really changed a lot of things for service desks. You find that this is a culture that's used to slow changes, project-based rollouts, waterfall, and suddenly they've got services appearing and changing all the time. So they're having to adapt to that, and adapt just to the fact that this general transformation that's driving DevOps is that more stuff gets written in-house by companies. Fewer things now are about supporting commercial off-the-shelf products. More is about dealing with internal development. Developers themselves, I mean, you're not working in Remedy and ServiceNow and Cherwell, you're working in SDLC tools. So we've actually had a lot of challenges about how you kind of even establish those networks of communication without it just being another chuck over the fence from one tool to another. And actually, digital transformation in itself, one of the biggest things that I think is impacting this, impacting service management concepts, is that a lot of the customers are now external. The ITSM has grown up around the idea that all the enterprise's technology is kind of seen by the employees, and then they serve people in other ways. That's not the case anymore. But on the other hand, DevOps has to grow into enterprises, and as we've already seen, some of those things are a challenge as well. How do you scale support? Developers are suddenly more and more directly involved in the sharp end of support, being on call. That's hard. And in reality, while it's easy to build, it's not easy to build a startup, but from a technology point of view, it's easy to perceive what the technology stack looks like when you build it from the ground up. When you're doing this in enterprises, you are going to be dealing with old and new technologies. Not everything will be rewritten and refactored. Banks still have mainframes. There'll still be that person who says, does this work with Active Directory? You've got to deal with those complexities. And one of the challenges of that is it's hard to get context. When you're paged at 4 in the morning, how do you know exactly what's going on in terms of the technology? And importantly, if you don't have the customer context, okay, I've got 10 really nice new innovations in my backlog, but now I've got 10 tickets. What do I have to do first? So service management's got a lot of value to bring to this community if we do it right. I think hopefully swarming is one example of us looking to do it right. Because ultimately, I mean, this quote I saw at that first DevOps conference, and it stuck, well, DevOps Alliance conference, and it stuck with me. It was Luke Kanies, who founded Puppet, who kind of called a halt to the way a panel discussion was going and pointed out, enterprises aren't actually stupid. Not all enterprises are stupid. Some enterprises are not stupid, but they're worried about their users. And that drives that slightly conservative, slow-moving culture. They're used to a culture where things are not done because we're scared. Now, we all know that your CIO, if they're smart, is holding a copy of the State of DevOps report and going, hang on, these outcomes are better when we move fast. But nevertheless, we have to understand this challenge. I talk about swarming a lot to ITSM people, and I talk about it in the DevOps context, and I show this slide, and I explain the and-on chord to them. Because that whole in ITSM, we have to realize that if we're doing something that's dumb, a movement that's come from the lean background will pull the cord. And actually, there's things that we've done in service management over the years. I've sat in the infamous change advisory boards, and they're not all wrong, but a lot of them are wrong. And there's times I could have pulled the ceiling down, I think, with some of the things that were going on. But all the things that tiered support does are antithetic. A lot of these things are very, very much against the things you're looking for in the movement. And so that's why I think swarming has to be promoted on both sides. Because work in progress queues, silos, lack of knowledge sharing, burnout, none of these things are good. So that's the point, really. If you're being drawn into support practices, I'd argue that swarming is the way to go. Swarming is something to lobby for. It builds on a lot of the principles you've established and proven as a movement. It's something that those of us who've kind of gone into it, not necessarily from the DevOps perspective, are seeing great success. So we should be banging the drum for this, I think. So I thought I'd have a little bit of fun, actually, and explore. You've seen how swarming is applied in some real enterprises, but I wanted to take something that, again, I first heard of as a concept in the DevOps world, Cynefin. Now, if you don't know Cynefin, I recommend finding one of Dave Snowden's appearances on podcasts, because he can explain it in 10 minutes better than anyone else can explain it in an hour, probably. But just to summarize, it's built in sort of complexity theory. How do complex systems fail? How do simple things fail? How do we address things differently? And so he talks about problems being in 4 different domains. And obvious is things that are clear cause, clear effect, easily understood, repeatable. Related to that is complicated, where we have a fixed path between cause and effect, but actually we've got to do a bit of work to figure out what the cause is first, so a little more complex. But actually complex things reflect the fact that when something complex fails, there isn't a single root cause, or at least there's nothing that's obvious. We have to experiment before we can even figure out what to do. Chaotic is kind of everything is on fire. We've got to limit the damage first of all. And this is getting a lot of attention in DevOps and ITSM, but one of the things we sat down and did as a little bit of a paper exercise was thinking, well, surely swarming adapts itself quite well. This is saying you have to be dynamic in the way you respond to things. So taking those principles, what if we applied swarming to that? Well, obvious, to be honest, if you're involving that service desk analyst, you're probably doing obvious wrong, or at least if you're involving them more than once, because we want to automate that stuff anyway, but it's very simple. As the Cynefin principle says, you sense it, you categorize it, you respond to it. We should automate that. When things get a little more complicated, this is a little more like our dispatch swarm, I think, where we've got to think, okay, we need to actually look into what the causes are here. We've got to figure out something first. So we'll just build a little, maybe pair a few people up, they can go investigating. So, all good so far. But I think where this could be really powerful, this kind of thinking, is in formulating and establishing an approach based on swarming for when things really are complex. Complex things, before we can even sense what it is, we have to probe and find out. So again, we can start by building out a swarm, and then they can start bringing in the right people to do that investigation. Maybe we start by bringing in the networks person and the developer. Maybe then it starts getting a little suspicious, because this could either be the cloud provider or our network or something, so we'll branch out and pull together little different groups. Have the swarm leader take one, have the deputy take another, and just bring ourselves to the point where we've changed this, as Cynefin principles would put it. We've brought this from being complex to complicated. We've identified what it is. We can send some of those people home. We know what we're doing, and we can pull it all together. And actually, of course, what we can also do here is think about the really chaotic situations, because again, swarming lends itself to this. You've got something that's really, really bad. We're containing damage as much as we're figuring out what's wrong. So again, this probably is not much different to what people are doing anyway, but it just kind of establishes that if we think about this in terms of swarms and practices, we can build a structure around that. I think the key point is here, from what we learned from doing this exercise, was that none of this really works very well in a 3-tier structure. Trying to map 3 tiers onto these types of response, especially to complex and chaotic situations, is hard. Thinking in terms of swarms, it's pretty natural. So what do we need? Well, you can probably tell, there are people in the ITSM community, like myself, like I know we've got Rob England and Cherry over here who've been also really sort of moved, especially Rob, who's been around in ITSM for a long time and is one of the, I think, one of the most forward people in that area. A lot of us are working very hard to establish how service management is actually going to bring you value, make your processes work, how we can all do this in a very progressive way. We need your help. I mean, we've got to understand how things emerge, how things change in your jobs as DevOps gets big in your enterprises. And you know, this is not a product conversation, as you can probably tell. This is about how those of us who are sort of trying to drive ITSM in the right direction can work with you to build on what you're doing and help you do it. Because at the end of the day, you have got a lot of currency to change your organizations in a broader sense than what you've been doing even within the scope of development and operations. You've got that state of DevOps report. You've got the successes you've built on. So let's all try and build on those things and work together and improve some of these practices that have served a purpose but need to change too. So finally, I'll end on this slide, and I've tweeted these links hopefully during the course of this presentation, unless I've got my time zones wrong on buffer, which probably has happened. So if that's happened, you'll get them at 2 in the morning. But this link on the left is the Consortium for Service Innovations page on swarming. It's worth looking at. I don't agree with everything in their models for the intelligent bit of swarming, but the principles are fine. And then over there is a blog I wrote a couple of years ago, which is kind of what's brought me here, I think, which is when I first tried to really deconstruct at length what is wrong with 3-tier, what is wrong for DevOps, how can we do it better. So by all means, take a read of that. And I'll be around at lunchtime, so thank you very much.